The moment Adelaide Whitaker's father pressed her hand into the rough, calloused grip of a man she had never met, the sun was bleeding red across the Kansas horizon like a wound that refused to close. She had not cried. She told herself she would not. She had made that promise somewhere between the moment her father announced the arrangement over supper and the moment she found herself standing in the amber dust outside Harlow's General Store in the town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, dressed in her mother's mended blue dress with her whole life packed into a single leather satchel at her feet. She had made the promise, and she intended to keep it, because Adelaide Whitaker had always been better at keeping promises than anyone around her had ever been at keeping them to her. Her father, Edmund Whitaker, was a man defined by his debts. He owed money to half of Caldwell and dignity to none of it. His cattle operation had collapsed the previous autumn after a brutal drought that left his land cracked and gray as old bone. What livestock had survived the drought, disease had taken. What the disease had missed, the bank had eventually claimed. Edmund Whitaker was 51 years old and had the hollow eyes of a man who had made a career of reaching for things just beyond his grasp, and Adelaide had spent the better part of her 22 years watching him do exactly that. The arrangement, as her father called it with the careful lightness of a man who could not afford to examine his own actions too closely, was simple. A man named Clarence Dodd, who operated the largest cattle brokerage in Sumner County, had agreed to absorb Edmund's remaining debt in exchange for Adelaide's hand in marriage. Clarence Dodd was 47 years old, wide as a barn door, and had buried 2 previous wives, a fact that the town whispered about in varying degrees of delicacy. He was not a violent man precisely, but he was a consuming one. Things that came into his possession tended to lose their original shape. What Clarence Dodd had not anticipated, and what Edmund Whitaker had either not known or not cared to mention, was that Clarence's business dealings had recently attracted the attention of a federal marshal, who had been quietly building a case against him for cattle fraud and land theft perpetrated against smaller homesteaders across 3 counties. By the morning of the arranged handoff, Clarence Dodd had been escorted out of Caldwell under federal authority and was riding toward Wichita in the back of a covered wagon with his hands bound. This left Adelaide Whitaker standing in the late afternoon dust outside Harlow's General Store with her satchel, her blue dress, and no arrangement at all. Or so she believed, until her father appeared at her side with the particular expression of a man who has solved a problem by creating a slightly different one. "There is still the matter of the debt," Edmund said, and he did not look at her when he said it, which was how Adelaide knew that whatever came next would require her to do the looking for both of them. "Papa," she said very quietly and very carefully, "the man is gone. The arrangement is done." "The debt is not done," Edmund said. "The debt is very much still standing." He had, it turned out, spoken with someone. In the scramble of the morning, when news of Clarence Dodd's federal troubles had spread through Caldwell like wildfire through dry grass, Edmund Whitaker had found himself a new arrangement. There was a cattle drover in town, a man who had arrived 2 days prior with a modest herd heading north toward Abilene. He had money enough to clear the debt. He had agreed, apparently, to take Adelaide along the trail as his wife. "You do not know this man," Adelaide said. It was not quite an accusation. It was something flatter and more exhausted than an accusation. "I know enough," Edmund said. She looked at her father for a long moment. She looked at the fine lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples, the way his hat sat slightly crooked because he had never bothered to reshape its brim. She had loved this man so completely for so many years that the grief of realizing the love was not equally matched had stopped feeling like grief and had started feeling like weather. Something you dressed for, something you moved through. "Who is he?" she said. "His name is Abel Atkins," her father said. "He is from Texas. I am told he is a decent man." "You are told, Adelaide. You are told by whom?" "By Harlow mostly, and by Tom Creddy at the feed store." Adelaide picked up her satchel. She did not know why she did it at that precise moment, except that her hands needed something to do that was not shaking. She looked west, where the sun was collapsing behind the flat line of the land, turning everything the color of embers. "Where is he?" she said. Her father led her around the side of the general store to the hitching posts near the water trough, and that was where she first saw Abel Atkins. He was leaning against the post with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, and the first thing she noticed was that he was not what she had expected. She had expected someone like Clarence Dodd, wide and certain of himself in the way that only men who had never been told no could be certain. What she saw instead was a man of perhaps 28 or 29, lean and brown from years of outdoor work, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his faded blue shirt and eyes that, when he lifted them to look at her, were the quiet gray-green of deep water. He had the hands of a working man. He had a rifle in the scabbard of his saddle and a single Colt revolver at his hip, worn with the easy familiarity of someone who hoped never to need it. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read, not triumphant, not possessive, something more careful than either of those things. "Miss Whitaker," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Mr. Atkins," she said. There was a silence between them that the wind moved through without helping. "I expect your father has explained the situation," Abel said. "My father has explained his version of it," Adelaide said. "I would hear yours." Something shifted in his expression then, a fractional thing barely visible, but she caught it. Surprise, maybe, or respect for the directness of it. "Fair enough," he said. He uncrossed his arms and stood straighter. "I have a herd of 312 head moving north toward Abilene. I have 2 drovers, both reliable men. The trail is about 3 weeks, give or take, depending on weather and water. Your father offered me an arrangement this morning. I accepted it." He paused. "That is the bones of it." "And the rest of it," Adelaide said. He was quiet for a moment. "The rest of it is that I am not in the habit of collecting women like property. I told your father I would take his debt and I would take you with me to Abilene, and that whatever happened after Abilene was a thing we could discuss when we got there. I did not promise him anything beyond the money and the trail." Adelaide studied him. The light was going fast now, orange bleeding into purple at the edges, and the first stars were beginning to show themselves in the high dark east. "You paid his debt and you have not yet decided whether you want a wife," she said. "I paid his debt because the man standing in front of me looked like he was going to crumble into the dust otherwise," Abel said, "and because nobody deserves to be handed off like a head of cattle. Not even," he stopped himself and cleared his throat. "That is to say, I believe a woman ought to have some say in what happens to her." Adelaide looked at him for a long time. The wind moved between them, warm and dusty, and smelling faintly of the prairie grass that stretched away in every direction beyond the edges of town. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "I am not a piece of property. I am not a debt settled. I am not an arrangement. I am Adelaide Whitaker, and I am 22 years old, and I have opinions about most things, and I will speak them aloud whether or not anyone wants to hear them." "I expect that is true," Abel said, and there was something at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "And if at any point on this trail you decide you want something from me that I have not offered freely," she said, "I will make your life significantly more complicated than any cattle drive." "I do not doubt it," he said. She breathed in slowly. Behind her she was aware of her father, shuffling slightly, uncertain what to do with himself in the presence of an exchange that was not going the way he had scripted it. "All right," Adelaide said. "I will ride with you to Abilene, and we will discuss the rest when we get there." She turned to her father then, and she said what she had been holding in her chest for the better part of the day. "Goodbye, Papa. I hope you find what you are looking for." She did not wait for his answer. She picked up her satchel and walked to the wagon tied beside Abel's horse. Her father said her name once, softly, at her back. She did not turn around. Abel said nothing either, but she heard him settle his debt with her father quickly, in low, businesslike tones, and then the jingle of coins and the sound of boots on the packed earth, and then he was at the wagon, checking the rigging with quick, practiced hands. "We will make camp about 4 miles out tonight," he said. "Get clear of town before it gets full dark." "Fine," she said. He helped her up onto the wagon seat. His hand was steady under her elbow, and he let go the instant she was settled, which she noticed and filed away carefully. They left Caldwell as the last of the daylight died completely, the wagon rolling out along the cattle trail with the small herd moving ahead of them in the warm Kansas darkness. And Adelaide Whitaker, who had cried every night for a week in anticipation of this moment, did not cry at all. She sat straight-backed on the wagon seat with her satchel between her feet and watched the lights of Caldwell diminish behind her, and what she felt, underneath all the fear and fury and grief, was something she had not expected to feel: relief. The camp they made that night was simple and clean. One of the drovers, a young man of about 20 named Hector Vega who had sharp dark eyes and a quick quiet laugh, had already gotten a fire going by the time the wagon rolled in. The other drover, an older man named George Birch who was somewhere in his late 40s and who wore his graying mustache with the gravity of a general's medal, was seeing to the cattle. Abel introduced them briefly. Hector tipped his hat with genuine warmth. George Birch gave her a measuring look and then a short nod that contained more acceptance than most formal welcomes she had received. "There is coffee," Hector said, "and there is the good news that George is a better cook than he looks." "That is a low bar," George said, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. "And yet he clears it," Hector said. Adelaide sat by the fire and wrapped her hands around the tin cup of coffee that Hector pressed into her hands, and she let the warmth of it move through her fingers and into her wrists and up her arms. Abel sat across the fire from her, working on a piece of leather tack that needed mending, his hands moving in that same quiet, practiced way she had already begun to associate with him. He did not look at her with hunger or ownership. He looked at her sometimes the way you look at something new in the landscape, something you are still orienting yourself around. "Do you do this often?" she asked. "Drive cattle to Abilene?" "Often enough," he said. 3 times a year, roughly, sometimes twice if the season is difficult." "Where do you go between drives?" "Back to Texas. I have a piece of land near the Llano River, small operation, mostly horses now. Cattle keep the income steady." "Do you have family there?" Something moved briefly through his expression. "My mother passed 4 years ago, my father when I was 14. I have a sister in San Antonio, married with 2 boys. I see her when the season allows." "I am sorry about your parents," she said. "I am sorry about yours," he said. "Or about the one you have at any rate." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. It was an unexpectedly precise thing to say, and she found she appreciated the precision of it. "He is not a bad man," she said, because she felt compelled to be accurate about it. "He is a weak one. Those are different things." "They are," Abel agreed. "My mother was strong enough for both of them until she died, and after that he just diminished, slowly, like something left out in the weather." "How long ago did she pass?" 6 years, Adelaide said. "I was 16. She had consumption. It took her through the winter." The fire crackled between them. The cattle were settling for the night, their soft sounds carrying on the warm air. Above them, the Kansas sky was enormous and blazing with stars, the kind of sky that was easy to forget existed when you were inside walls. "What did you want?" Abel asked. "Before all of this, what did you want for yourself?" The question startled her because nobody had asked it. Not her father, certainly. Not any of the suitors her father had paraded through their lives in the years since her mother's death. Not anyone in Caldwell, where a woman's ambitions were generally assumed to be matrimonial and therefore settled. "I wanted to teach," she said, and then felt slightly exposed by how quickly the answer came. "I can read well and write well, and I am good at arithmetic. I thought when I was younger that there might be a way to become a school teacher. Why did that not happen?" "Money," she said, "and my father needing me at home, and then the cattle operation failing, and then," she gestured vaguely at the darkness around them, meaning all of it, the whole chain of events that had brought her here. A school teacher, Abel said. He was looking at her thoughtfully. That is not an impossible thing. Most things are not impossible, she said. They are simply made difficult by circumstance. He nodded slowly, and she had the sense that he was thinking about something he was not yet ready to say. She did not press him. George's cooking, it turned out, was genuinely good. He made a simple stew with salt pork and dried beans, and wild onion that Hector had apparently found near a creek that afternoon, and it was hot and filling in the way that trail food rarely was, at least in Adelaide's admittedly limited experience of trail food. She slept that night in the wagon, wrapped in a blanket that Abel had given her without ceremony, and she lay on her back looking up at the canvas above her and listening to the sounds of the camp settling into sleep. The cattle breathed in the darkness. Someone had the first watch. She could hear the soft movement of a horse nearby. Somewhere far off, a coyote called out once and was answered from a different direction. She had been handed to a stranger at sundown. She did not yet know what the sunrise would bring. The trail north to Abilene was 250 miles through the open heart of Kansas, and Adelaide learned it the way you learn most important things, one day at a time, from the ground up. The first morning she woke before everyone else, which surprised her. She had always been an early riser, but she had expected the strangeness of the situation to keep her restless and groggy. Instead, she woke with the first gray light, climbed down from the wagon with her hair loose and her boots in her hand, and walked to the remains of the fire to stoke it back to life. Abel was already there. He was sitting on his bedroll with his boots on and his coffee already made, watching the eastern sky lighten by degrees. He looked at her without surprise. "You are an early riser," he said. "Always," she said. "My mother was too. She said the morning belonged to the people willing to show up for it." "Smart woman," he said. He poured a second cup of coffee from the pot at the edge of the coals and handed it to her without being asked. She sat on a nearby rock and they watched the sunrise together in silence, and it was, she realized, not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that meant neither of them felt the need to perform for the other, which was a rare thing in her experience. The herd moved north at the pace cattle moved, which was slow and deliberate and occasionally maddening. Hector and George worked the flanks and the rear with the practiced efficiency of long experience, and Abel rode point most mornings, a dark figure against the pale sky ahead. Adelaide drove the supply wagon, which she had insisted on doing herself after the first morning when Abel had asked tentatively if she minded the task. "I'm not here to be decorative," she had said. He had laughed at that. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a good sound, low and genuine without any performance in it. "I did not think you were," he said. "I was going to ask if you had driven a team before." "I have," she said. "My father's horses, less well-behaved than yours, I suspect." "Biscuit and Frank are very professional," he agreed, which made her smile despite herself. She drove Biscuit and Frank through the long Kansas days, following the broad, dark trail of the herd, and she watched the land. She watched it closely, the way you watch something you are seeing for the first time but suspect you will remember for the rest of your life. The prairie was not dramatic. It did not have mountains or forests or the theatrical beauty of things that announced themselves. It was subtle and enormous and honest, rolling away in every direction under a sky that simply refused to be small, and something about the scale of it settled something in her chest that had been wound tight for years. She and Abel talked in the evenings. This became the rhythm of those first several days, the work of daylight and the conversation of firelight, and she found that she looked forward to the firelight hours with an intensity that surprised her, and then, after she considered it, did not surprise her at all. He told her about Texas, about the Llano River country, which he described with the restrained affection of a man who was not comfortable with outright sentiment but who felt it nonetheless. The cedar breaks and the clear cold water, and the way the deer moved through the hills at dusk. He told her about learning to ride from his father, who had been a rancher of modest success and considerable skill. He told her about the drive routes he had learned, the water sources that could be trusted and the ones that could not, the spots where the grass was reliably good and the spots where it always thinned. She told him about Caldwell, about the school she had attended until she was 16, the teacher, a woman named Mrs. Pierce, who had told Adelaide with no ceremony whatsoever that she had the sharpest mind of any student she had taught in 15 years. About her mother's garden, which had been the only genuinely beautiful thing about their property, full of morning glories and marigolds, and a climbing rose that bloomed against the fence every June without fail. About the books she had collected, slowly and carefully over the years, the small library she had assembled on 2 shelves in her bedroom, which she had packed into her satchel as completely as she could manage. "You brought books," he said the third evening when she pulled out a dog-eared copy of Jane Eyre to read before the light failed completely. "I brought 5, she said. "I had to choose carefully. The satchel has limits." "Which 5?" She listed them. "Jane Eyre, David Copperfield, A Natural History of the American Plains," that she had found at a church sale for 2 cents. A slim volume of poetry by a poet whose name she had trouble pronouncing but whose work she had loved since she was 17, and a pocket-sized Bible that had been her mother's and which she carried less for devotion than for continuity. He was quiet for a moment. "I have a book," he said. "Just one. I have been hauling it on every drive for 4 years and have read it so many times the spine is gone." "What is it?" He went to his saddlebag and came back with a battered volume. He held it out to her. She took it and turned it toward the firelight. "Moby Dick," she said. "I know it is peculiar reading for a man who has never seen the ocean," he said, "but there is something in it about the pursuit of a thing that costs you everything that has always seemed relevant." She looked at him for a moment over the book. "Have you pursued something that cost you everything?" The fire moved between them. He looked at it for a moment before he answered. "I had a wife," he said, 4 years ago. Her name was Clara. She died in childbirth along with the baby, a son." He said it quietly and directly, in the manner of someone who has made peace with a grief not by diminishing it, but by learning to carry it without letting it consume them. "After that I sold most of what we had been building together and went back on the trail. It was not the bravest thing I could have done, but it was what I could manage at the time." Adelaide was quiet. She set the book down carefully. "I am sorry," she said, "truly." "Thank you," he said. "I am better now than I was. 4 years is a long time to be figuring something out, but eventually you figure it." She thought about that. About grief as a thing you figure out, not a thing you get over, and she found she believed him, and found she understood him better for it. "My mother," she said, "used to say that losing someone does not make you less of a person. It makes you a different one. And the work is deciding what kind of different." He looked at her then with an expression that was more open than any she had yet seen from him, something that was not quite vulnerability but was in its vicinity. "That is," he said and stopped. "That is a wise thing to say." She was a wise woman, Adelaide said. They sat with the fire between them and the stars overhead and the quiet breathing of the herd in the darkness, and something between them that had been carefully formal and appropriately guarded began, very slowly, to soften at its edges. The 7th day brought trouble, though not the kind Adelaide had feared. She had been half-braced for the particular kind of trouble that came from being a woman alone on a trail with men she did not know. The kind of trouble that whispered in the back of every woman's mind whenever she found herself outnumbered and far from anything resembling help. But what she found instead was that Hector treated her with uncomplicated respect and a kind of little brother cheerfulness that she found genuinely warming, and that George had apparently decided she was competent within the first 24 hours and had thereafter included her in the ordinary business of the camp, without ceremony or condescension. The 7th day's trouble came in the form of a dry creek bed where the map, a hand-drawn thing that Abel had been consulting since Caldwell indicated reliable water. "It has been dry here before," George said, crouching at the cracked earth that should have been a flowing creek. "Last summer, maybe. The cattle are going to need water before sundown or we will lose pace tomorrow." Abel stood at the edge of the dead creek with his hat in his hand, and the hot wind moving through his hair. Adelaide could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. "There is a ranch about 6 miles west," Hector said. "Saw it yesterday from the rise. If they have water rights, they might let us through." "Might," George said. "I will go," Abel said. He looked at Adelaide. "Will you ride with me? I will feel better with someone else who can speak." She blinked at that. "You want me to help negotiate?" "I want you there," he said. "Ranchers in this part of Kansas can be territorial. A woman sometimes changes the tone of a conversation." "I expect that is true," she said dryly, "and I have opinions about the fact that it is, but I will ride with you anyway." He almost smiled again. She was beginning to catalog his almost smiles and the circumstances that produced them. They rode west on his horse, which was a tall gray gelding named Scout, with Adelaide in the saddle and Abel behind her, in a configuration that was necessitated by the fact that Adelaide had not ridden in some time, and the terrain was uneven enough to require someone who knew the horse. She was intensely aware of him behind her, his chest near her back, his arms coming forward around her to hold the reins, and she was further aware that she was not uncomfortable with the proximity, which was itself a notable development. The ranch was called the Calder Spread, run by a heavy-set man in his 50s named Ben Calder, who came to the door of his house with a rifle and a suspicious expression that softened approximately 30% when he saw Adelaide, which she noted with the mixture of gratitude and irritation that she was coming to recognize as her default response to the useful unfairness of the world. "My husband has a herd north of here," she said, which was not precisely accurate but was close enough to the shape of the situation that she did not let herself examine it too carefully. "The creek is dry. We have 300 head in need of water, and we are wondering if there is any chance of bringing them through your land to access the river." Ben Calder looked at them. Then he looked at his wife, a small spare woman who had appeared at his shoulder. "Let them through, Ben," the woman said. Ben Calder let them through. On the way back, riding across the flat golden land with the afternoon heat pressing down and the grass moving in slow waves around them, Adelaide said, "I called you my husband." "I heard," Abel said. "It was expedient." "I know." A pause. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "No," he said. "Does it bother you?" She considered the question with the care she gave most things. "Not as much as it perhaps should," she said. He said nothing to that, but she felt something shift in the way he sat behind her, something settling, and neither of them said anything for the rest of the ride, but the silence was different than it had been before, warmer at its edges, more deliberately kept. They got the cattle to water before sundown. That night after supper, Hector produced a battered guitar from the supply wagon with the air of a man unveiling a treasure, and played 3 songs in a row with considerable enthusiasm and moderate technique. George pretended to be annoyed and then sang quietly along to the third one, which was a gentle old Spanish melody that Hector had apparently learned from his grandmother. Adelaide sat with her back against the wagon wheel, and her knees drawn up and her hands folded in her lap, and let the music move through the evening like something that belonged there. Abel sat beside her. Not across the fire as he usually did, but beside her, close enough that she could hear the slight change in his breathing when Hector's song reached its slow, aching chorus. Close enough that when she shifted slightly, her shoulder almost touched his arm. She let it. He did not move away. "Do you dance?" she asked. "Badly," he said. "I expect badly is good enough for out here," she said. "Are you asking me to dance, Miss Whitaker?" "I might be working up to it," she said. He laughed again, and this time it was longer, less contained than the first time had been, and it moved through her like sunlight through water, touching everything it passed. "I have noticed," he said when the laughter had settled, "that you work up to things very deliberately." "I think things through," she said. "I always have. My mother called it prudence. My father called it stubbornness. Both can be true at once," he said. "Most things can be," she agreed. Hector finished his third song and began a fourth, something livelier, and Adelaide stood up and held her hand down to Abel, and he looked at it for a moment and then took it, and they danced awkwardly in the firelight beside the wagon while Hector grinned and played faster and George watched with the expression of a man who is pleased by something and has decided not to show it. Abel danced, as promised, badly. She did not dance much better. But they were laughing before the song was half done, and she could not remember the last time she had laughed like that, openly and without any performance in it, just because something was genuinely funny and joyful. And when the song ended, they were standing close together and still holding hands, and neither of them immediately let go. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with that expression she was becoming familiar with now, the careful one, the considering one. The one that meant he was feeling something he was not yet certain he had the right to feel. She decided, in that moment, that she was going to be precisely as patient as necessary, and not one heartbeat more. "Abel," she said. "Adelaide," he said, and the way he said her full name, all 4 syllables of it like something he was learning by heart, did something very particular to her sternum. "I think," she said, "that when we get to Abilene we are going to have a great deal to discuss." "I think you are right," he said. They let go of each other's hands at approximately the same moment, and went to their respective sleeping places, and Adelaide lay in the wagon looking up at the canvas, and felt the particular, vertiginous sensation of something very large beginning. On the 12th day, they crossed a wide, shallow river in the afternoon heat with the cattle going through in their long, unhurried stream, and on the far bank there was a family camped, a man and woman and 3 children, their wagon wheel shattered and their horses exhausted. Abel pulled up and swung down from Scout before anyone had said a word. She knew by then that this was one of the things he did, simply saw what needed doing and did it, without ceremony or delay. The family's name was Marsh. Thomas and Ellen Marsh, with children of 8, 6, and 4, heading for a new homestead claim in North Kansas. The wheel had broken 2 days ago and they had been waiting, hoping someone would come. Abel and Hector and George spent the better part of the afternoon breaking down the damaged wheel and constructing a replacement from timber they cut from a stand of cottonwoods along the river, using the tools from the supply wagon and the particular ingenuity that men who worked with their hands developed over years of being far from anyone who could do it for them. It was not a perfect wheel, but it was sound, and by the time the sun was beginning to descend, the Marsh wagon was rolling again. Ellen Marsh took Adelaide's hands in both of hers and her eyes were full. "You did not have to stop," she said. "Of course we did," Adelaide said. "There are people who would not have," Ellen said. Adelaide thought about this later, sitting at the fire with Abel after the Marsh family had moved on with effusive gratitude and the children's waving arms still visible in the distance. "People who stop and people who do not," she said. "What?" Abel said. "She said there are people who would not have stopped. I have been thinking about what makes the difference." He poked at the fire with a stick. "I expect it is mostly about whether you see other people as people," he said. "Some folks do. Some folks see them as inconveniences or obstacles or nothing at all." "Which one were you raised to be?" "The first one," he said. "My mother was very clear about it. She used to say that every person you meet is carrying something heavy and you may not know what it is, but you can choose to make their day a little lighter or a little heavier, and that choice says everything about you." Adelaide turned to look at him fully. He was still looking at the fire. "Your mother sounds like she was extraordinary," she said. "She was," he said simply. "She was the best person I have ever known." A pause. "Until recently, possibly." He said it without looking at her, directed at the fire, and she felt the warmth of it move through her like something radiant. She did not say anything. She let it stand, the way you let a good thing stand without touching it. The 14th day brought a different kind of trouble. They had camped near a small settlement, a handful of buildings, a saloon, a trading post, a livery, the loose collection of commerce that preceded actual towns on the frontier. Abel had needed to resupply, and they had all ridden in together in the early afternoon. The trouble was a man named Sutton, which was apparently all the name he used, who approached the supply wagon while Abel was inside the trading post, and Hector was at the livery, and George was seeing to the cattle at the edge of the settlement. Sutton was approximately 35, with the lean, hungry look of someone who had been living by his wits for long enough that the effort had hollowed him out, and he looked at Adelaide sitting on the wagon seat with an appraising expression that she recognized immediately and found immediately objectionable. "You look like you are a long way from home," he said. "I am exactly where I mean to be," she said. "Is that so?" He stepped closer to the wagon. "Where are you heading?" "North," she said, which was not quite an answer but was the only one she intended to give him. "North is a big place," he said. He put a hand on the wagon. "You traveling alone?" "No," she said. "I do not see anyone." "That is your limitation, not mine," she said. He blinked at her, apparently recalibrating. She kept her expression level and direct, the way her mother had taught her, because she had learned early that showing fear to a man like this was like showing blood to a wolf. She was aware peripherally of the sound of boots on packed earth, and then Abel was at the wagon, not running, not making a production of it, simply there, standing at the horse's shoulder with a bundle of supplies under one arm and his eyes on Sutton. "Something I can help you with," he said. His voice was perfectly even. Sutton looked at him, looked at the colt at his hip. Did the calculation with the speed of someone who had done similar calculations many times before. "Just passing the time," Sutton said. "Time is past," Abel said. Sutton moved on. Abel loaded the supplies without comment. He climbed up to the wagon seat and took the reins. After a moment Adelaide said, "Thank you. You had it well in hand," he said. "I did," she agreed, "but it is still good to not be alone in it." He looked at her sideways and the corner of his mouth moved. "That is the most I will ever say about needing someone," she said, with the precision of total self-awareness. "I will remember it," he said. They drove out of the settlement and back to the herd, and she thought about what she had said and whether she meant it, and decided that yes, she did mean it, which was itself a remarkable thing, because Adelaide Whitaker had spent 6 years learning not to need anyone, and she was discovering now that the lesson had been thorough but not complete. On the 16th day, there was a rainstorm. It came out of the southwest in the early afternoon, with very little warning beyond a sudden drop in temperature, and the particular quality of stillness in the air before the sky opened. Adelaide had learned enough about the trail by then to read that stillness, and she was already covering the supply wagon with the waterproofed canvas before Abel had come back from the point to tell her to do it. He arrived back at the wagon at a canter, rain beginning in earnest now, his hat brim shedding water and his shirt going dark. "You covered the supplies," he said. "I covered the supplies," she said. He swung down from Scout, and together they got the horse secured to the side of the wagon and pulled the canvas far enough to provide some partial shelter. The rain was heavy but not violent, the kind of warm spring rain that made the air smell of wet earth and new grass, and they sat under the edge of the canvas with their backs to the wagon, while the herd moved slowly through the downpour under Hector and George's careful management. The rain made a continuous sound on the canvas above them. They were sitting close, their shoulders touching, because there was only so much dry space and neither of them moved to increase the distance. "Tell me something," she said. "What kind of something?" "Something you have not told anyone," she said, "or not many people." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the gray curtain of rain. "When Clara died," he said slowly, "I was in town. I had been gone 2 days to register the land claim and get supplies. I came back and she was already. It had happened quickly. The midwife had done everything she could." He paused. "I have spent 4 years telling myself that I could not have known, that there was nothing I could have done. And I believe that mostly." He looked at his hands. "But there is still a part of me that has never quite forgiven himself for being somewhere else." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. The rain pressed down around them. "You were not somewhere else," she said. "You were doing the work of building the life you were building together. Clara knew that. The midwife knew that. The only one who does not entirely know it is you." He turned to look at her. The rain was close and gray and the world had contracted to just the two of them under the edge of the canvas. "You are very certain of things," he said. "I am very certain of most things," she said. I am less certain of some things recently. What things? She looked at him. You. The words sat between them in the rain sound, honest and uncomplicated and absolutely deliberate. He looked at her for a long moment. What are you uncertain about? He said, and his voice was lower now, quieter. Whether what I feel makes sense, she said. Whether it is the circumstances making it feel larger than it is. Whether she stopped. Whether it is real, he said. Yes. I have the same uncertainty, he said. I also have less and less of it each day. She looked at him. The rain was easing slightly, the gray of it softening. Abel, she said. Adelaide, he said. And then he reached out and tucked a wet strand of hair back from her face with 2 fingers, the most careful touch she had ever experienced, and she leaned into it slightly before she could stop herself, and he let his fingers rest for a moment at her temple before he drew his hand back, and she felt the absence of that touch like a physical thing, like the ending of music. When we get to Abilene, he said. Yes, she said. When we get to Abilene. The rain stopped an hour later, and the sun came out over the washed land, and everything smelled clean and bright, and Adelaide drove the wagon north through the afternoon light, with the feeling that she was moving towards something rather than away from it, which was a distinction that mattered enormously. The last day before Abilene, the 19th day, they camped on a rise with the lights of the city just barely visible on the northern horizon, a dim glow against the darkness like a promise. Hector had found wild berries along the creek that afternoon, and George had made something that was generously described as a cobbler. Using trail biscuit dough and dried sugar, he had been hoarding for the occasion, and they ate it around the fire with the warmth of completion spreading through the camp, because a herd driven 300 miles is a significant thing, and they had done it well. George told the story of the worst drive he had ever been on, which involved a lightning strike, 3 broken wagon axles, and a territorial dispute with a party of land surveyors that had ended in a very tense game of poker. Hector told a story about a horse that had understood Spanish perfectly and been deeply offended by English. Adelaide told the story of the time she had accidentally released her father's entire chicken flock into the town square of Caldwell on a Sunday morning, which had consequences for both the chickens and the Sunday service that took weeks to fully resolve. Abel laughed so hard at that story that he had to set down his cobbler. Later, when Hector and George had settled into their bedrolls and the fire had burned down to orange coals, Abel and Adelaide sat together on the rise looking north at the distant lights. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "We said we would discuss things when we reached Abilene," she said. "We did. I thought I would start with what I know," she said, "and we can go from there." "All right," he said. She drew her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and looked at the distant lights, not at him, because some things were easier to say to the horizon. "I know that I arrived on this trail as an arrangement," she said, "a piece of a transaction. And I know that you paid my father's debt because you thought it was the right thing to do, and that you did not actually know what you were agreeing to when you agreed to it. I know that." She paused. "I also know that in 19 days you have not once made me feel like property. You have listened when I spoke. You have asked my opinion. You have let me work alongside you. You have been honest about your grief and your past in a way that cost you something." Another pause. "I know that I have not laughed as much in the past 6 years as I have in the past 19 days. I know that when you put your hand near my face in the rain, I did not want you to take it away." She stopped. He was quiet for a moment. "Adelaide," he said. "I am not finished," she said. "I also know that I want to make my own choices, that whatever happens it has to be mine to choose, not my father's. Not the circumstances, mine." "Of course," he said. "So I am telling you what I know," she said, "and I am asking you, not as an arrangement and not as a debt, but as one person to another, what do you want?" The silence that followed was long and deliberate and full. "I want to show you the Llano River country," he said. "I want to watch you teach a classroom full of children who do not know yet how fortunate they are. I want to hear what you think about every book you have ever read and every idea you have ever had. I want to dance badly with you at every opportunity." He paused. "I want to build something with someone who builds with her whole self. He stopped and she heard him breathe. "I want you to choose me, freely, knowing that I will spend whatever time I have trying to be worth it." She turned to look at him then, and he was looking at her with the most unguarded expression she had seen from him. All the careful reserve dropped, just himself underneath it, honest and uncertain and exactly as she had come to know him. She reached out and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers. "I choose you," she said, "freely. In full knowledge." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles slowly, with a reverence that made her breath catch. And then he looked up at her over their joined hands with something in his expression that she would spend the rest of her life trying to adequately describe and never quite manage. "Then we will figure out the rest," he said. "We will," she said. They sat on the rise in the warm night with their hands joined and the lights of Abilene ahead of them, until the fire had gone entirely cold, and the stars had wheeled overhead toward morning, and Adelaide Whitaker, who had been handed to a stranger at sundown, felt with absolute certainty that the man beside her had done something that Sundown had not expected. He had handed her back her freedom, and she had chosen with that freedom to choose him. Abilene in 1878 was a city in the process of figuring out what it was. The great cattle boom years were slightly behind it. Dodge City had taken the more southern trade routes, but Abilene still hummed with the energy of a town that had known big days and expected more of them. There were solid buildings along the main street, a hotel with an actual restaurant, a courthouse, 3 churches, and more saloons than churches, which was fairly standard for the frontier at that time. Abel delivered his herd to the buyers at the stockyards on the north end of town with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this many times, handling the negotiations with the cattle broker with a quiet firmness that she found quietly impressive. The price he received was fair, he told her later with the satisfied tone of a man who had done his arithmetic correctly. Hector was paid first and shook Abel's hand with both of his, and then insisted on hugging Adelaide, which she returned with genuine warmth. He was heading south to visit his family in Texas, he said, and he would look for work with Abel again in the fall if the season allowed. George was paid second and received his wages with the dignity of a man who never needed to be told he had earned them. He shook Abel's hand and nodded at Adelaide. "You did well on the trail," he said to her. "Thank you, George," she said. "Wasn't a compliment exactly," he said. "More of an observation." "I will take it anyway," she said. The corner of his mouth moved very slightly. He put on his hat and walked away, and that was George Birch. Abel and Adelaide had a room at the hotel, 2 rooms technically, which Abel had arranged without discussion or pressure, which she noted. The hotel was plain but clean, with a window that looked out over the main street and the constant movement of the town. They ate in the restaurant that evening at an actual table with actual tablecloths, which after 19 days of trail meals felt extravagant to a degree that made Adelaide laugh softly when she sat down. "What?" Abel said. "A tablecloth," she said. "I have been eating out of tin cups for 3 weeks, and here is a tablecloth." He smiled, and by now she knew his smiles fully, knew the slow one and the surprised one and the one he gave when he was trying not to, and this one was the warm one, the comfortable one, the one she liked best. They ate a proper meal, beef and potatoes and corn bread and pie, and they talked about what came next. Abel was planning to rest in Abilene for several days before heading back south. He would resupply and rest the horses. Normally he would ride back to Texas, to the Llano River place, and spend the summer before the fall drive. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever your answer is, I will respect it." "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Here, now or nearly now in Abilene, before we go anywhere else?" She looked at him across the white tablecloth with the lamplight warm between them. "You have thought about this carefully," she said. "I have thought about almost nothing else since we left Caldwell," he said. "I know it is fast. I know that reasonable people would take more time." I also know that I have spent 4 years being careful about every single thing, and I am reasonably certain that what I feel is real, and I am asking you." She folded her hands on the table. She thought about it, which was her way, carefully and completely, turning it over and examining it from all sides. "On one condition," she said. "Name it." "We go to the Llano River country," she said, "and we find the nearest town that needs a school teacher, and you support me in pursuing it." "Done," he said without hesitation. "You did not even think about it." "I thought about it for the past 4 days," he said. "I was hoping you would ask." She looked at him for a long moment. He was watching her with steady gray-green eyes and steady hands, and the patience of a man who had learned through loss the value of not rushing good things, and the equal value of not letting them pass. "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached across the tablecloth and took both her hands in his, and she let him, and the lamplight moved over them both. They were married 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning in May of 1878, by the Methodist minister in Abilene, in a small church on the east end of the main street, with dust motes moving through the late morning light and the distant sound of cattle on the air. The minister was a cheerful man named Reverend Hooper, who married probably 3 or 4 trail couples a month, and had the well-practiced warmth of someone who had seen enough of life to know that love under difficult circumstances was still love. Adelaide wore the blue dress, the same blue dress she had been wearing when her father pressed her hand into a stranger's at Sundown 3 weeks ago, and she had mended the small tear at the hem and washed it, and it was as fine as it was going to get, and that was fine enough. Abel wore a clean shirt, dark blue, and his best hat, and he had shaved that morning, and he looked, she thought, exactly like himself, which was precisely what she wanted. There were 2 witnesses, a woman from the hotel named Josephine, who had taken an immediate liking to Adelaide and agreed without hesitation, and a fellow cattleman of Abel's acquaintance who was in Abilene on similar business. Adelaide had no flowers. Josephine from the hotel had appeared that morning with a small bunch of blue and yellow wildflowers she had apparently gathered from the field east of town at first light, and she had pressed them into Adelaide's hands with the matter-of-fact generosity of a woman who understood what things mattered. When Reverend Hooper asked Adelaide if she took this man of her own free will, she said yes with the full weight of every word she had ever meant. When he asked Abel, Abel said yes, and then looked at her directly and said, "Completely," in the way that made the Reverend look slightly moved and Josephine produce a handkerchief. They were married. They rode south from Abilene 4 days later, taking the longer route home that passed through the hill country of central Texas, because Abel had said there was something he wanted her to see, and she had said she was willing to see it. What he wanted her to see, it turned out, was the Llano River. They came over a rise on the 7th day of the southward ride, and the river was below them, clear and green-blue in its rocky bed, moving through cedar-covered hills that rolled away in every direction under a sky that was the precise rich blue of early June. The air smelled of cedar and warm rock and water. Adelaide pulled up her horse, which was a quiet sorrel mare that Abel had bought for her in Abilene and named Penny, and looked. "There it is," Abel said beside her. She looked at the river and the hills and the cedar-scented air. "It is beautiful," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been carrying this view in my head for 4 years on every drive, and it never quite matches the memory." "Does it match now?" He looked at her. "Better then," he said. They rode down to the river and watered the horses and sat on the rocky bank in the afternoon light, and she took off her boots and put her feet in the cold, clear water, which made her gasp and then laugh, and he sat beside her with his boots still on and watched her with the expression she had come to love most, the soft one, the open one. "Tell me about the house," she said. He described it. Stone walls, the local limestone, 2 rooms with a loft, a front porch that faced east for the morning light. A barn in reasonable repair, a kitchen garden that had gone somewhat wild in his absences, a good well. "How far to the nearest town?" she asked. "Mason," he said. "About 8 miles. Reasonable size. German settlers mostly, good people. I have not heard of a schoolteacher there recently. She looked at the river. 8 miles, she said. I have a good horse for you, he said. Penny seems capable, she said. She is, he said. She looked at him. Are you nervous, she asked. He considered it. Some, he said. This is the first time I have brought someone to this place since Clara. It feels significant. It is, she said. You do not have to pretend it is not. I know, he said. That is what I am still getting used to, that I do not have to pretend anything with you. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he covered it with his own hand. You never did, she said. Not once on the whole trail. I think that is why we are here. The house was everything he had described and also more. The way places you love are always both smaller and larger than their descriptions. The stone walls were thick and cool. The porch did face east, and the kitchen garden was indeed magnificently overgrown with things that were in various states of wildness. There were morning glories climbing the fence, which she did not point out to him, but which she noticed privately with a sharp and quiet joy. The first week they cleaned and repaired and restocked, working together through the long, warm days with the comfortable efficiency that had developed on the trail. She went through the house with the systematic energy of someone who intends to understand a place before she inhabits it, and he gave her that space without crowding it, watching sometimes with a warmth that she could feel across the room. She found Clara's things in a cedar chest in the loft. A small pile of dresses, a handkerchief with embroidery, a journal. She closed the chest carefully and went back down the ladder. There is a cedar chest in the loft, she told him. He was still briefly. Yes. I left it as it was, she said. It belongs there, she belonged here. He looked at her for a long moment. Thank you, he said quietly, for understanding that. She was part of you before I was, she said simply. That does not need to be pretended away. He came to her then, crossed the room and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a moment before he kissed her. And it was a gentle and completely sincere kiss, warm with everything they had been building since Caldwell and full of the particular depth of people who have been honest with each other from the beginning. She kissed him back with equal sincerity. In August, she rode into Mason and found the school. It was a one-room building on the edge of the town, well constructed, with large windows for light and 12 small desks and a blackboard. The man on the school board, a stout German-American named Friedrich Huber, looked at her carefully when she presented herself. You can read and write, he asked. In English and some Latin, she said. I can teach reading, writing, arithmetic, basic geography, and history. I have been self-educated beyond those basics, and I can continue self-educating. I am a fast learner. He looked at her a moment longer. You are married. I am Mrs. Abel Atkins, she said. Your husband supports this. My husband drove me into town himself and is currently at the feed store, she said. Friedrich Huber made a sound that was either satisfaction or resignation. The school opens in September, he said. 32 enrolled children between 6 and 14. I will be ready, she said. She was. The schoolroom became hers in the way that things become yours when you give them your full attention. She organized it, cleaned it, decorated the walls with things that were meant to be seen and thought about. She stood in front of her first class of 32 children on the first morning of September and felt, for the first time in years, precisely where she was supposed to be. She taught them reading with the seriousness of someone who believes reading is the most consequential thing a person can learn. She taught them arithmetic with patience and a pragmatic emphasis on things they would actually use. She told them stories about the wider world, the oceans she had never seen but had read about, the mountains, the cities, because she believed that knowing the shape of the world beyond your own horizon was a form of freedom. In the evenings she rode Penny home to the stone house along the river, and Abel was usually there before her, and there was supper and firelight and conversation, and she felt the shape of their life together filling in around her like something solid and right. He talked to her about the land, about his plans for expanding the horse operation, which he had a genuine gift for, the quiet way he had with horses that she had noticed on the trail and found she could not stop noticing. He talked about a smaller fall drive, just one more, maybe with a partner, to bring in enough to make the land improvements he had been putting off. She told him about the children. About a small boy named Thomas who had arrived at school in September unable to read a single word, and who, by November, was reading 2 grades above his age. About a girl named Liesel Huber, Friedrich's daughter, who had a mind for arithmetic that Adelaide had decided needed active development, and had accordingly been giving her additional problems to solve. About the older children who were starting to trust her enough to ask real questions about the world, about their own futures. Abel listened to all of it with genuine attention. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered details. He was, she discovered, as good a listener as anyone she had ever met. On a Sunday in late October, they rode out to a high spot above the river that Abel had shown her in their first week there, and sat on the warm limestone in the afternoon sun and looked out over the cedar hills and the silver thread of the river below. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I was not certain when I agreed to your father's arrangement in Caldwell that I was doing the right thing," he said. "I told myself I was doing a decent thing, which is not the same. I was not sure I was capable of what your father was suggesting. I was not sure I had anything left to give someone." He looked at the river. "I want you to know that I was wrong about that. And I want you to know that everything I have is yours, not because of an arrangement, not because of a debt, because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I am—" He stopped and gathered himself. "I am profoundly grateful for every mile of that trail." She looked at him for a long moment. The October light was warm and gold on his face, and the river moved below them, and the cedars smelled of themselves, sharp and sweet and clean. "Abel," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, "I want you to know that when my father pressed my hand into yours at sundown in Caldwell, I thought my life was ending, the life I had chosen for myself, the life I had wanted." She breathed. "What I discovered instead was that you handed it back to me, all of it, my choices, my voice, my future. You never once tried to take any of it, and you have spent every day we have been together making more room for me, not less." She reached over and took his hand. "That is not a small thing. That is an extraordinary thing, and I love you for it." He turned to look at her with the full, open expression that she loved, the one that held nothing back. "I love you," he said simply. "I know," she said, "and I love you, and I wanted to say it clearly out loud in the sunlight." He brought her hand to his mouth. They sat on the limestone above the river, and the afternoon stretched around them, warm and golden and unhurried, and she thought that this was what a life that belonged to you felt like, not the absence of difficulty or the lack of uncertainty, but the presence of choice, the presence of someone who valued your choices, the presence of the river and the cedars and the enormous sky. In December, she discovered she was expecting. She told him on a cold, clear evening by the fire, and he went very still for a moment, and then he looked at her with an expression that was equal parts joy and vulnerability and everything they had discussed and understood about the grief that had come before this moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. How are you feeling?" "I am well," she said. "I feel well. I wanted you to know." He was at her side of the fire within seconds, and he took both her hands in his and looked at her, and she saw in his face the full weight of what this meant to him, the hope and the love and the fear that anyone who has lost this way carries forward into the next time. "We will be careful," he said. "We will get the doctor from Mason. We will." "Abel," she said. "Yes." "Breathe," she said. He breathed. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, and he closed his eyes, and they stayed like that for a long moment by the fire in the stone house beside the Llano River. "I am not afraid," she said, which was not entirely true, but was true in the way that mattered, the way that meant she was going to face whatever came with her full self. "I will be here," he said, "every moment." "I know," she said. "That is why I am not afraid." The pregnancy moved through the winter, and the spring with the care of a thing attended by 2 people paying close attention. The doctor from Mason, a careful young man named Dr. Prairie, who had trained in San Antonio, came out to the house every few weeks and declared everything proceeding normally. Adelaide continued teaching until April, when the children's mothers began arriving at the school with expressions of collective concern, at which point she agreed to take her leave with the understanding that she would return in September. She filled the spring with books and the garden, which she had cleared the previous summer and which was now producing with genuine enthusiasm. She and Abel had long conversations in the evenings about names, about the future, about the world they were bringing a child into and what they hoped to give it. A mind for itself, Adelaide said. That is the first thing, whatever else. Room to grow, Abel said, not just told what to be. Yes, she said, exactly that. A father who shows up, he said quietly. She looked at him across the supper table. You have been showing up since Caldwell, she said, long before you needed to. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her, and she could see the peace in his expression, the settled thing, the grief that had been carried so long it had finally found a place to rest. I've been thinking about Clara, he said, about what she would make of all this. And, Adelaide said gently, I think she would have liked you, he said. I think she would have thought you were exactly right. He paused. I think she would have been glad I stopped pretending I was done. Adelaide reached across the table and took his hand. She sounds like she would have been a good person to know, she said. She was, he said. She was kind and stubborn and not afraid of anything, a little like someone else I know. Adelaide smiled at him, slow and warm. Only a little, she said. He laughed. In August of 1879, their son was born. It was a long night and a hard morning, but Dr. Prairie was steady and skilled, and the women from Mason who had come to help were capable and calm. And Abel stayed, which was the thing Adelaide had needed most. He stayed in the house and came to her between times and held her hand when she needed it and spoke quietly when quiet was what the moment called for. And when the baby arrived in the early morning, red-faced and indignant and immediately vocal about his opinions, Abel held him with the careful wonder of a man who has been given back something he thought the world had permanently taken. "Hello," he said to his son, very softly. The baby looked at him with a profound lack of recognition of the newly born. "I am your father," Abel said. "I am going to do my best." Adelaide, exhausted and aching and completely certain of more things than she had ever been certain of simultaneously, watched from the bed and felt a love so large it seemed to require the full dimensions of the room to contain it. They named him James Edmund Atkins. James because Abel had always liked the name. Edmund after her father, a choice she made with full deliberation, not because Edmund Whitaker had earned it, but because Adelaide Whitaker Atkins believed that extending grace was its own kind of strength, and she intended to pass that belief on in the naming as much as in the living. She wrote to her father. A short letter, factual and without bitterness. She told him she was well. She told him she was teaching. She told him she had a son. She told him that she had chosen the man he handed her to completely and of her own will, and that she was grateful for the life that had resulted. She did not lie to him. She did not tell him what he had done was right, but she gave him the news of his grandson because that news was true and good and he deserved to know it. Edmund Whitaker wrote back 3 weeks later. The letter was short and stiff, the letter of a man who was not comfortable with vulnerability but was trying to find the edges of it. He was glad she was well, he said. He was glad the man had been decent. He was sorry, he wrote, in a sentence that seemed to have cost him a great deal. He hoped the boy was strong. She wrote back. She told him the boy was very strong. She left the door open as much as she could because Adelaide Whitaker Atkins believed in open doors even when the people walking through them were complicated. James grew through that first year with the single-minded determination of a person who knows exactly what he wants and has opinions about everything else. He had Abel's eyes and Adelaide's stubbornness, and a laugh that came easily and often, and he was, by general consensus of the people in and around Mason, the finest child that stretch of the Llano River country had ever produced, a conclusion that was biased and therefore no less sincerely held. Adelaide went back to teaching in September, with James carried along in a basket for the first several months. And then, when he became mobile and opinionated, left with a woman from town named Maria Gutierrez who had 6 children of her own, and found one more entirely manageable. The school had grown while she was away, 38 enrolled now, a product of the settlement continuing to expand, and Friedrich Huber had indicated that a second teacher might be needed within a year or two, which Adelaide was already thinking about. Abel expanded the horse operation as he had planned, bringing in a breeding pair that had cost him the profit from the fall drive and turned out, by the following spring, to have been worth every cent. The horses he raised were sound and steady, and increasingly in demand among the ranchers and drovers of the area, and the work suited him in the complete way that work you are genuinely gifted at always does. He gave up the long cattle drives after James was born, a decision he made without resentment, and with the clear satisfaction of a man who has moved from one good chapter to another. Hector Vega came back to the Llano River country in the spring of 1880, as he had said he might, and ended up staying. He found work at a neighboring ranch, and then found a young woman named Rosa from Mason who had her own sharp opinions and considerable warmth. And within a year, he was a settled man with roots going down into the same landscape that Abel and Adelaide inhabited. He became, in the easy organic way of the frontier, a part of their lives, someone who showed up for the heavy work and the celebrations and the ordinary evenings with equal reliability. George Birch appeared one fall morning in 1881 as unexpectedly as a change in weather, rode up to the gate with his hat pulled low and his mustache unchanged, and said he had heard there was work. "There is always work," Abel said. George unsaddled his horse. He stayed. The second pregnancy came in 1882, announced with the same quiet directness with which Adelaide announced most things. This time the fear was less and the anticipation was fuller, and Abel was steadier too, still attentive and present but less shadowed, more open. A daughter arrived in March of 1883, small and very determined, with dark hair and gray-green eyes that were unmistakably her father's. They named her Ruth Alina, and James, at nearly 4 years old, approached his sister's existence with a mix of imperial suspicion and genuine tenderness that was entirely characteristic of him and entirely charming. The stone house had been expanded by then, Abel and Hector having added 2 rooms the previous summer, and the kitchen garden had expanded too, and there were morning glories on the fence every June like a promise that Adelaide's mother had made and the land was keeping. One evening in the late fall, after supper and after the children were in bed, Adelaide and Abel sat on the porch in the cool air with the river sounds below them and the stars overhead, and it was quiet in the particular full way of quiet that 2 people make when they have filled their life together with enough things to give the silence depth. "I was thinking today," Adelaide said, "about that ride from Caldwell to Abilene." "Were you?" Abel said. He had his coffee in his hands and was looking at the stars. "I was thinking about the first night," she said. "How terrified I was. I did not show it, but I was terrified." "I know," he said. "I knew then." She looked at him. "You knew. You held your coffee cup like it was the only solid thing in the world," he said. "And you talked to Hector about very ordinary things in a very careful voice that meant you were keeping yourself together by concentrating on the words." She was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that." "I noticed everything," he said, "from the first moment. Even in the dust outside Harlow's General Store. Even then," he said. "You stood there with your satchel like you were daring the world to try you. I thought—" He paused. He looked at his coffee. "I thought if she trusts me I will not waste it." She looked at him for a long time. The porch was cool and the stars were enormous and the river was below them and the children were asleep inside and the morning glories were done for the season and would be back in June. "You did not waste it," she said. "I tried not to," he said. She moved to sit beside him close, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the ease of years of practice and the knowledge that some things, if you are very lucky and very careful and very honest, become more themselves with time rather than less. "I love this life," she said. "So do I," he said. The river moved below them in the darkness. The land stretched away in all directions, enormous and patient and full of the particular silence of the frontier, which was never truly silent, always full of wind and water, and the small sounds of living things going about the serious business of being alive. In the spring, the morning glories would come back. James would turn 6 and begin to read, with enthusiasm and a speed that Adelaide recognized as familiar and deeply satisfying. Ruth would take her first real steps across the porch floor toward her father with the expression of someone who has solved an important problem. Friedrich Huber would come to Adelaide with news that the school board had approved a second teacher, a young woman from San Antonio with 2 years of normal school training, and Adelaide would spend the summer preparing to run an actual 2-room school, which was nearly as exciting as anything else that had happened to her. George Birch, in a development that surprised everyone, and also, on reflection, surprised no one, would be found one Sunday sitting in the front pew of the Mason Church beside a quiet widow named Helen Carr, an arrangement that George would describe as casual, and that everyone around him would recognize as nothing of the kind. Hector and Rosa would have their first child, a boy they named Abel Hector Vega, a tribute so direct and unembellished that Abel had had to look away for a moment when he heard it, and Adelaide had not looked away because she wanted to see his face when he heard it, and what she saw there was worth watching. Edmund Whitaker would come west in the summer of 1884, an old man by then, gray and much diminished but alive, traveling by train as far as San Antonio, and then finding a way north to the Llano River country with the stubborn determination of someone who has decided to do a thing that should have been done much earlier. He would stand at the gate of the stone house with his hat in his hands and look at his daughter with the eyes of a man who has spent years understanding something he understood too late, and Adelaide would open the gate and let him in, because she believed in open doors, and because James and Ruth deserved a grandfather, even an imperfect one, and because forgiveness, as her mother had always said, was not about the other person's worthiness. Edmund would stay for 2 weeks. He would sit on the porch with Abel in the evenings, and the two men would talk carefully around the edges of a shared history, and eventually, slowly, arrive at something that was not forgiveness exactly, but was workable and honest. He would read to James with more patience than he had ever shown Adelaide as a child, and she would watch from the doorway with the complicated love of a daughter who knows her father's limits and has decided to value what he has rather than grieve what he does not. When he left, he held her hands and said, "She would be proud of you." She knew who he meant. "She would be proud of me," Adelaide agreed. "And she would have told you so herself, at considerable volume." Edmund laughed, which was a sound she had not heard from him in years, and she was glad of it. The years moved forward the way good years do, accumulating rather than simply passing. The stone house became gradually more itself, each room and surface taking on the character of the lives lived in it. Books on every shelf that would hold them, children's drawings pinned to the walls, a hook by the door where Abel's hat lived, a tin on the kitchen counter where Adelaide kept the pencils she was always losing and always finding, the garden that bloomed every June with morning glories and something growing in it every season. The school grew. By 1886, Adelaide had 3 teachers under her, including the young woman from San Antonio, and a roll of 62 children, and had begun a campaign with the county school board for a proper second building, writing letters and attending meetings, and making arguments with the systematic force of someone who has been told no before, and found it merely an invitation to try harder. The second building was approved in 1887. She stood at the dedication in October of that year with Abel beside her and Ruth on her hip and James holding her hand. And Friedrich Huber made a speech that was entirely too long, but contained the genuine warmth of a man who had been argued at for 3 years, and was willing to admit it had been worth it. Abel put his hand on the small of her back during the speech, and she leaned slightly into it, and felt the whole weight of what they had built. Not just the school and not just the house, and not just the expanded horse operation, and the network of good people they had gathered around them, but the thing underneath all of it, the solid, true thing, the choice they had made together freely on a rise outside Abilene with the lights of the city on the northern horizon. Later that evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, she found Abel on the porch looking at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" she said, settling beside him. "Caldwell," he said. "That dusty stretch outside Harlow's store, the way you picked up your satchel like it was the only thing in the world that was yours." "It was then," she said, "that and the books. And now," he said, looking around at the darkness that held everything they had made. "And now," she said. She took his hand and he turned it over and held hers, the way he had held it on the rise outside Abilene, the way he had held it on the limestone above the river, the way he had held it in every important moment since the first one. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For being the kind of man you are," she said. "For seeing me as a person when you did not have to. For handing me back my own life when you could have taken it." She was not given to sentimentality, but she was given to accuracy, and this was the most accurate thing she knew. For being worth choosing. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him feeling the weight of the words, the way he always did, not deflecting them but actually receiving them. "You handed me back something too," he said. "I had stopped believing I had anything worth giving. You changed that." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The river moved below them. The stars were very large. The children slept inside the stone house. The morning glories were done until June, and the land was settling into its autumn quiet, and the whole of the Llano River country was going about its serious, beautiful business of continuing to exist. It had started with Sundown and a stranger's hand and a satchel with 5 books in it and a sky bleeding red over Kansas. It had become this. It had become everything. And in the morning, as it was every morning, the sun would come up over the eastern hills, and the river would catch the light and throw it back at the sky, and there would be children laughing in the house, and coffee on the stove, and horses moving in the corral, and a woman riding 8 miles to a school that needed her, and a man who would watch her go with the permanent, irreducible expression of someone who has been trusted with a remarkable thing, and does not intend to be anything less than worthy of it. The sun would come up, it always did, and the life they had chosen freely was waiting in it.